Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things.
2, 1, 0, all engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower clear.
We're having luck, but other sightings apparently were taken more seriously.
And one in particular, an incident called the Rendall Ship Forest Incident, also known as Britain's Roswell. This was in 1980, shortly after Christmas, when a few American airmen who were stationed in the UK reported seeing a UFO.
A huge, solid, diamond-shaped object they described as 100 foot long, hovering silently in the sky above them.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone, whatever that means.
American public and global public finally understands UFOs are real. This is a technology that is so far beyond anything that we have.
Reportedly appear to exhibit unusual flight characteristics, appear to demonstrate advanced technology.
Arrow is the culmination of decades of DoD, intelligence community, and congressionally directed efforts to successfully resolve UAP encountered first and foremost by U.S. military.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Disclosure Team with me, your host, Vinny Adams. The following is an interview with Graeme Rendall. Graeme is a UFO researcher, author, member of UAP Media UK. In this interview, we talk about Graeme's latest book, Chasing Shadows, Aerial UFO Encounters, 1955 to 1956. We look at two cases featured in the book, one of them being one of my all-time favourite cases, the Lake and Heath Bentwaters case from 1956. If you enjoy this content, please take a second, hit that like button, subscribe if you don't already, comment down below, or share it with your friends. I really appreciate all the support. I hope you enjoy this interview with Graeme Rendall. Graeme, good to see you. How have you been?
Hello, Vinny, mate. I'm fine, I suppose. How are you doing on the other side of the pond?
Yeah, not bad at all. Like I mentioned to you then, just before we hit record, it's the same thing, just a different location. So not much has changed. But obviously, I wanted to get you on because you have just released your latest book. I'm always excited by these. And so I'd love to just dig into it a little bit about those specific 2 years that the book covers. But before we do, just, how was, obviously, I imagine the research was pretty similar in the way that you put the book together. But if you could just tell us about where you go to get all this information and how it kind of comes together.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically just archives. So it's the archives of the Royal Air Force and also the records from the US Air Force and basically any other kind of online, sort of repositories that there are. I mean, the Internet Archives are a really good source of information. Most of the Blue Book documents are actually on there that are publicly available. But there are some other sites, of some long-standing sites, from some of the UFO research groups, which are equally, really good to actually just confirm details and see different takes on various cases. So you kind of weave your way through all this information to try and sort of tell a story. Now, some of the stories obviously are well known, but others not so. So I guess it's, you don't maybe concentrate so much on the well-known ones. You try and bring in the ones which people don't know much about or even nothing about. And those are the ones you try to tell, in a way that actually, people get something out of the book rather than just, oh yeah, it's just a rehash of old cases kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a really good point. Some of these cases that people may not have heard about are just so detailed, the occurrences, the things that happened, are really eye-opening, and I think it's really good that they've been sitting out there in these archives for so long, and now they're being brought forward so many decades later. It's just amazing. So
yeah, that's it. Because everybody tends to concentrate on the well-known cases, and they're just they're basically repeated ad nauseum. And it's a shame that the other ones, okay, they may not be so important, and they may not have so much information, but actually they do all build up the picture. And it's important. It's really necessary to actually just go through them and give them a bit of an airing now and again.
Yeah, totally. And I think what's important, not just of this book, but all of your books, is that all of these occurrences were happening so long ago before we could use the excuse of advanced US technology or China or Russia. So painting that big picture, I think, is so vital to this, this current climate of, the focus being on such modern things happening in Congress and everything. But this is why I always say the history is so important. And I think it's great that you're still bringing forward new information.
Yeah, thanks, Benny. I appreciate that.
No problem. So did this book take you down to the National Archives in person again at all?
It did. I mean, when I was down there, I think the last time, obviously, I think it was just after I came back from New Mexico with you. I was the day before I came home. I thought I'm going to have a day in London again and hit the archives and see and just pick some things up that I knew I needed just to finish a few of these, a few of the cases off, or just to find out whether there was actually anything that was, that people either hadn't found out before, or just something that needed reinforced. So yeah, it's always worth looking just to see what they've got, and you never know, you might turn up something new. So yeah, it's quite good.
Yeah, it is. And the one thing I'll say to people about going to the archives, obviously we went down in 2021 when we were all down in London, and one thing I found that you have to request the files before you get there, so you kind of almost have to know where you want to look. And then to some people that might seem daunting because, well, I don't know where to look. I'm going down to try and find. Can you just explain about how it works a little bit?
Yeah, you have to know what you're looking for, so you know what you can ask for. That's really how it works. So you almost need to know the name of the file, or if not the name of the file, and you have to be very, very kind of broad with the search terms, but also quite narrow specifically as well. That seems like a contradiction in terms. But you can't just rock up to the archives in London and say, give me everything that you have about UFOs, because they'll only give you the ones that have UFOs in the title. Well, they're all known anyway. So you have to be more creative, and you have to sort of expand this kind of, what do I look for? Do I just look for things about experimental airplanes, or do I look for things about rockets? And I'm going back to the wartime stuff that I've looked at with the Foo Fighters, and I ended up just going through in various intelligence files from the Air Force until I started hitting upon things that actually, this is the kind of mother lode. So yeah, you have to be, you can't just go and say, give me your stuff about UFOs, because they will just look at you blankly and just give you the stuff that everybody's seen already, all the data dumps that pretty much people know about.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I did find helpful for when I was looking at certain documents when I was there was that people have put their information out online and said, I found this information in this archive. And if it's something related similarly to what I wanted to look at, I could kind of get a little bit of an idea. I mean, it's still not that easy, but it can be found. Yeah.
Patient. You just need a bit of patience and just a little bit of kind of research before you do your research, if you like. So yeah, you need to be, sort of prepared before you go down.
Yeah, absolutely. So this book covers 1955 to 1956. So we're a decade after the end of World War II. Can you just give us an idea of what the current climate's like in Europe and the US when it comes to kind of aviation in general? We must be getting into the jet age a bit now.
Oh yeah, you definitely are, and we're almost on the cusp of operational supersonic aeroplanes for the air forces around the world. So the Russians are, they've got a couple of prototypes, which they've actually got them past the prototype stage. They're almost about to put them in production, or just have, but they're not seeing squadron service. The same sort of happening in America as well, and the Brits aren't that far behind either. So where the first generation jet fighters, if you like, they're almost about to type of run their course, but they're still in squadron service. They're still being used for scrambles against, unknown contacts, whether they're radar or as a response to, sort of visual sightings of strange things. So they feature still quite a lot in this book. And yes, okay, the early rocket development's still going at pace, both in Russia and America. The Russians are still, they're just beyond their kind of rebuilding German rockets from the war. They have advanced a little bit beyond that, and they're getting towards the point where they're going to be able to put a satellite in orbit. And the Americans, actually, they were sort of lagging a little bit behind at this stage, but they were also getting there as well. So they weren't too far away, maybe 4 or 5 years away, sort of thing, from putting a man up into maybe not orbit, but certainly that kind of low Earth orbit, or just like a kind of into the higher stratosphere. So they're getting quite technical now, but also the overriding thing is the Cold War. This is we're getting towards the depths of it. So the antagonism between the two sides, the Warsaw Pact and NATO, is getting really deep. And of course, you've got these mass ranks of airplanes on either side of the border, the inner German border in Europe. So they're looking across the border at each other. We have aircraft testing our defenses. We have aircraft theoretically testing American defenses, but also we're just a couple of years after the end of the Korean War, so there's still an American presence out in the Far East as well. So yeah, there's potential flashpoints right across the globe. But things are still fairly calm, although there's obviously the kind of implied this could be the next kind of Russian bomber coming to attack America. So everything's taken very, very seriously if it's reported to air defense, and they all scrambled towards any unknown contact. That still happens.
Yeah. And what's the state of radar like at this time in the mid-50s?
It's improving. It's better than the first generation from World War II, where the kind of what you would see on a scope, you had to almost had a kind of a degree in being able to interpret blobs on a screen. It wasn't like you see, in the movies where you see a kind of like a revolving kind of line and a blip coming up. Sort of thing. That was about this time, so you have much more sophisticated radars where they have what they call planned position indicators, which is your kind of what we think is a scope where you see the blips come up on it, whereas beforehand you had to actually interpret two lines and a kind of like a peak in a kind of like a line that went up and down, and that's where you worked out distance and height and sort of thing. Where it's much easier nowadays at this time to actually work out where things are. That said, there are still kind of anomalous propagation on radars. You'll get, weather angels, that kind of thing, false echoes. But because we're now, a decade or more into radar, probably 15 years or so into radar in widespread use, it's much more known about, these things are much more understood, and they're obviously accepted. And if you are part of a radar station, part of the personnel, the technicians, you'll be told, this is what happens here. Don't worry if you pick this, that, and the other. So really, you shouldn't be sort of reacting to things which you should actually be aware of.
Yeah, and is that across the board from the US to Europe to Russia? They're all using ground radar, but also what's the state of play when it comes to radar in these planes as well?
So they've moved on from World War II, where again they had the same kind of thing that the ground stations had, albeit miniaturized. So the jet fighters, they'll have a pilot and a navigator on board. Usually, it was usually still too much work for the pilot to do everything, say at night, or when you have a night fighter or an all-weather fighter. So they would be two-seat airplanes. So the pilot would do the flying, and the guy in the back, the radar observer or radar navigator, depending on what you call him, he or the radar operator, depends on which air force, they all have different terms. But he would do all the stuff with electronics, and he would basically just give a stream of vectors and distance to the pilot to say, look, turn this way, go that way, all this kind of thing. And then when they got close enough, the pilot would be able to take over with a radar gun sight, and actually in some airplanes that would take over the kind of this is when you fire, whether it's your guns, your cannon, air-to-air missiles, not quite there yet. They're just about again to start using those. So again, we're on the cusp of another technological breakthrough. Europe, RAF airplanes, and we'll talk about a particular type of a night fighter in a little while. Again, they had radar on board, so there was two crew. They also had a radar-controlled gun sight for the pilot. So, again, technological kind of, improvements from the war. The Russians, a bit more clunky, but they still do that kind of thing as well. Although their aircraft didn't really have two seats, so their night and all-weather capability wasn't as good as the Western powers. But they would get there eventually, sort of thing, but not quite yet. So their stuff was daytime intercepts, and of course American fighters that were day fighters. These usually were just single seaters. So the pilot would do everything. They would be controlled from the ground towards a contact. And then when they got close enough, their onboard radar would actually take over the intercept. And it would just be a case of, the lock on with a radar gun sight and then fire. And that's how, I'd say easy, but that's, how kind of simple the whole concept was.
That's great. I mean, so it's safe to say that the technology is certainly advancing, and it's an important data point, let's say, when it comes to these cases. I think that's kind of what I was trying to get towards. But let's talk about the state of actually ufology in the 50s, because, post Roswell at the end of the 40s, we're well into the 50s, and even in kind of popular culture with some of the UFO flying saucer movies of the time. What would you say that was like at that time, mid-50s?
Oh, it's definitely got into the public psyche in terms of the movie. So you've had the kinds of the thing from another world. You've had The Day the Earth Stood Still. They were both 1951. You've had Earth v. the Flying Saucers, which is a classic kind of UFO invasion film. There's plenty of films since then as well, right up until 1956, where where the book is. There's even actually a kind of drama documentary film, which it's called UFO, which comes out in, I believe, in early 1956, which is actually described in the book. It's quite dated if you ever see it now. And you can see it on YouTube, and it is extremely dated and extremely stilted as well. But for the time, it actually did have a good run for its first couple of weeks, and people wanted to see it. So there was still a clamor from the public to learn about UFOs, but the press had actually not drifted away entirely, but they weren't as, I guess, enthusiastic as they were leading up to those 2 weekends in July 52, when they had all those sightings over Washington, D.C. Because in the press conference that the U.S. Air Force Air Intelligence basically got together straight after the second weekend, they sort of put the pressers and the journalists' mind at rest, saying, look, this is nothing to look at, to get worried about. It's all just radar kind of propagation and all this kind of stuff. So the press went a little bit cold. They still printed stuff about UFOs all the time, but there wasn't that kind of a momentum that was creeping up over from 47 up to 52, but it wouldn't go away. So they still had Blue Book, because that was still going through 55 and 56, albeit with different directors. So Ed Ruppelt had gone. They had somebody called Captain Gregory, who was in charge at this particular time, and he was the kind of person who just wanted to get out, I think. He was looking to impress his superiors by just not massaging the figures, but making sure he could solve pretty much every case that came across his desk. So if there was a hint of a balloon in a case, well, that's what it was, effectively. And that's how he operated. But going back to the public side of things, there was still, I guess, a clamor from certain sections of the population to know about UFOs. So you have the rise of the UFO newsletter, civilian groups, investigation groups. So they're either firing off newsletters, which are just based lots of cases sent in by members and by members of the public, or they're actually doing kind of groups where they have speeches and talks, and people come and give lectures and things like that. So we're seeing the rise of those, and you see them there's a few that kick off in America. There's also ones in France at this time, and other countries around the world, New Zealand, Australia, etc. They're starting. So there is that kind of private initiative. It's not just the military who are looking into UFOs.
Yeah. I mean, and you mentioned Blue Book being run out of the Air Force and that, but at this time as well, do we see the intelligence community getting in to try and shape the narrative? Is there CIA involvement in the 50s?
They are still involved. It depends on how much when you read things, you have to work out between the lines how much they were actually involved. And yes, they were. They were certainly passing information that they were gathering from sort of Eastern European countries at this time and passing on to relevant agencies. And a lot of that actually involved UFO reports from behind the Iron Curtain. So there'd be a newspaper, let's say, that was printed in Russian or Bulgarian or Czech or something like that, and they would actually interpret it, because anything that had any kind of maybe advanced technology, whether it was something that the Russians were building or whether it was potential alien tech, was of interest to various, like the Air Force or the intelligence community in America, because anything that was better than the Americans had was something that they needed to know about. So yeah, things like that would get translated, and then they would actually be sent up to various places around America. So whether it was the FBI or the CIA or the Air Force, or you name it, it went there. So yes, there was a lot of kind of involvement from the CIA at this time.
Yeah, and what about the UK? Because correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure somewhere in the early 50s, we had the British Flying Saucer Working Party and things like that.
We did. Yeah, and that was the early 30s. It actually predates this book, so it had already been and gone by then.
Right. Okay.
So it's funny because the UK are kind of like really slow. Okay, they've had that Flying Saucer Working Party, but then it just like dies down again. And Air Force pilots were still able to talk to the press quite early on in the early 50s, but it got the point where the RAF went, you can't do this anymore. All this information, you're just letting it into the public sphere. And then they put a moratorium on and said, look, pilots can't talk to the press without permission. So there was a clampdown here as well. And yes, okay, stories got into the press, but there were a lot of things reported from other countries, and they were just just passed on, if you like, to our readers. And there was it doesn't seem to be a huge amount of kind of things by the government to say, look, we're investigating this behind closed doors. And then when you see various reports from Britain, like obviously the one we're going to talk about shortly, yes, there were some possible investigations, but as to what the full extent of them, we still don't know, because a lot of documents from that period have been destroyed or potentially destroyed in the intervening years. So we don't really know how much information was looked at and what the outcome was.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we are going to get into a couple of cases from the book, but just before we do that, how does it? Is there a big picture here that in the mid 50s, these kind of UFO things were happening across the board, around the globe? It wasn't just the US, that everyone always thinks it's always a US kind of incident or a US subject. So how did you break down the split through the book of where the cases came from?
It's basically, I've tried to include every aerial case I can find from those 2 years. So you do cover the globe. The cover of the book, which you can see behind me here, is a case from the northern tip of Greenland, involving a Russian airplane. So we'll have that side of things, because they were seen up in the Arctic. And obviously there were civilian cases in the Antarctic at this time, but they were ground-based. But you have cases from Australia and New Zealand. We're going to talk about one of those in a little while. But you have cases from South America. So they're picking up. There are pilots who are on scheduled flights, but also Air Force airplanes, which are seeing things in the skies above Brazil as well at this time. So, there's a different continent straight away. But also there's cases over Africa, which are in the book. You have ones over Eastern Europe and over Western Europe, and then of course America, Canada, the far north, and over the Pacific and the Far East. So yeah, it's a global thing. It has been actually for some years. So if people who will have read the previous books in this series will get that already. That that UFOs were already a worldwide concern and a worldwide phenomenon, but as the years go on and more cases, at one point actually in this book there's a suggestion, and that's all it is, by a gossip columnist in a British newspaper, that the Air Ministry had a map where it had 34,000 pins in it, which were the location of UFO reports across the globe. Personally, I think that's probably rubbish, but I was going to use a different word there, but but it makes for an interesting story, and actually there's probably a little bit of truth in it, so much as if anybody did have a map of every UFO case around the globe at that time, that probably wouldn't be far short of that total, and
wow.
You'd have to especially reinforce the kind of map, just so you can actually hold all that weight of metal pins.
Yeah, 34,000. That's
probably
a lot.
I mean, let's say you're going through everything in recorded history, before 1956, and you can dig out reports from everywhere, anything that might potentially be UFO. I may be exaggerating slightly, I probably am actually, but it would be in the thousands, so you would have to have lots of pins on a map. But that's actually the phrase that's used in this particular article. So I thought, that's going in the book, because that's amazing.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good idea, is to, put as much corroborating data and information in a book, but also these kind of other things on the peripherals as well.
Yeah, because it gives an
things are
idea of what's
talked about.
going on in the background at this time,
Yeah.
because it's in the newspapers, it's being talked about by the intelligence community, it's being in the press, it's everywhere. It's not just something that's confined to things behind closed doors. People do see it everywhere, everywhere they look. So yeah.
Hey guys, just interrupting this interview quickly to let you know about the Anomalous Research and Exploration Forum. It is a 2-day virtual conference put on by myself at Disclosure Team towards the end of April. If you head on over to the website, the link is in the description. You will have a look at all of the speakers and guests for the event, including Danny Sheehan, Avi Loeb, Beatrice Villarreal, Graeme Rendall, Chris Sharp, Carl the Crusher, and more. Go and check it out. I really, really appreciate all the support. It's going to be an excellent weekend, and I hope to see you there. Right, so what is it we're about to listen to, Graeme?
So what we're about to listen to is the pilot of the National Airways Corporation DC-3 airliner. He's called Captain Rainbow. And not a lot's known about him outside this particular case, but he was him and his crew were party to a UFO sighting over New Zealand on the last day of October 1955. And this is one that actually did have an official investigation in New Zealand by the Air Force, but also it then passed to the Carter Observatory in Wellington. So there was various parties involved, and it got as far as the Air Minister for that country. So we can go a little bit into that once you've played this clip. But this is basically the captain's sort of statement as to what happened.
On the night of the 31st of October 1955, I was captain of Flight 108, proceeding from Wellington to Auckland. We departed from Paraparaumu in excellent weather, and conditions remained so until we ran into a warm front, which was lying across our track at Raglan reporting point, and extended out to the west, where it lay in a northeast to southwest direction. At sunset, visibility was excellent, due to a full moon and little cloud over the air route. At 20:06 hours, as I was looking towards the southwest direction, a very brilliant light caught the corner of my eye. This light was positioned above 8/8 cloud, the tops of which appeared to be about 6,000 feet, and also below a scattered middle cloud. My first impression was that it was a meteor, or a planet setting in the southern declination, but after closer investigation I could see that it was moving by about 2,000 feet above the cloud tops, and it was changing its light intensity from a bright hard light to a brilliant light in a cycle of approximately 3 seconds, and changing colour from white to yellow to orange to red. It appeared to be to the west of Watara and at the same altitude as us. I then asked the co-pilot, First Officer S. Trounce, to have a look towards our tail and to tell me what he thought the light could be. At first, his impressions were the same as mine, but he could not understand the change in brilliance in the light, its colour, or the fact that it was overtaking us at the same altitude. He also suggested I open the window to eliminate any refraction error, but it made no difference to the object. I then asked him to go to the cabin and ask a Mr. Tuckett, who is a civilian aviation officer and an experienced pilot, to watch the light and to ask if he thought it was a planet. During the co-pilot's absence, I called Wellington Control and asked if there were any known aircraft to the west of New Plymouth, and their answer was negative. I next called them and told them that there was a bright light to the west of New Plymouth, and to ask Flight 135 if he could see it. The last part of my message was jammed by Wellington Control, who were at that time doing just that. I next called up and said that this bright light was changing colour and passing to the west of us at a distance of, if I remember rightly, 10 to 15 miles, and at the same time giving him the incorrect call sign Flight 135. Flying Officer Trounce then returned to the cockpit, where at this time the object was just west of our wingtip and still at the same altitude as ourselves. Our autopilot was engaged on the same course of 330 degrees compass, as it had been for the last 10 minutes since Uhura checkpoint, and this I checked to ensure that I was not turning towards the west, and so explain the object's changed position in relation to our course. I could also see the object flying in and out of a few tops of the cloud, which was now building up as we approached the front. After a further close look and discussion with the co-pilot, I then told him to go back to the cabin and waken Air Commodore Cohen, and to get him to have a look at the object and so confirm what we were seeing. As the co-pilot was in the cabin, we entered the front, and knowing that there were no other aircraft on the air route, I climbed up to 9,000 feet, whereupon this object was easily picked up below us and ahead. After several more minutes' observation, I obtained our clearance to come down to 4,000 feet in preparation for landing at Auckland, and so lost contact upon entering cloud again. During the descent, the co-pilot returned to the cockpit and informed us that the Air Commodore stated that it was a planet, and took no further interest and went back to sleep. Then I went back to the cabin and spoke to Mr. Tuckett and asked if he thought it was a planet, and to this he said no, and that he had never seen anything like this before. And Mr. Hume in the seat ahead of him also confirmed all that Mr. Tuckett, Trounce and myself had seen. I then approached the Air Commodore and asked his opinion, to which he remarked that it was a planet low down on the horizon, but he made no further comment when I said that it had definitely passed us at 8,000 feet. Upon arrival at Wenipai, I notified the officer on duty at Wenipai, and as far as I was concerned, there the matter rested.
This star, or Venus, was seen at the back of the aircraft, and the aircraft's going in a straight line. It's not deviating from its course, and then it moves around the aeroplane to the point of where it was ahead of the airplane at one stage. Now, unless the aircraft actually turns to one side, that can't happen for a stationary object like a planet. So on one hand, you've got a few, actually this Air Commodore Cohen, he was the Inspector General for the Royal New Zealand Air Force at the time. So he was asleep apparently when the sighting started. He was woken up. He must be through bleary eyes. He looks at this, what looks to be a scintillating star on the horizon, which, that if the aircraft had turned, that you could argue that's what it was. You could say it was Venus or a star. And then he just goes back to sleep and says, "No, it's just Venus, or it's just a star." So you've got that side of it. But the pilot and the co-pilot know that they haven't altered from their 330-degree course. And actually, when they get back, on the ground, and then there's an investigation launched. The Air Minister, he's called T.P. Shand, and he basically puts into the hands of the Carter Observatory, which is an astronomical observatory in Wellington. And the director writes this formal letter saying, with all this information about where Venus was and how long it took to set, etc., basically saying that the pilot saw Venus. That was the upshot of it. So, and then there was also a civilian sighting on the ground nearby where they saw something which probably was Venus because they'd misinterpreted it. Because obviously they were in a fixed position, they weren't moving, so you couldn't have this, the difference between the aeroplane and somebody on the ground. So you've got two sightings, both of which you have a guy who's quite high up in an observatory and knows about astronomical phenomenon, who's saying both the aircraft pilot and this person on the ground saw Venus. So what is the Air Minister going to do? Well, he's going to actually go with him, isn't he? So he basically, comes out with, the pilot must have changed course. And in fact, this Air Minister releases a statement, and he says, the conclusion, it seems escapable that that's the pilot, allowed his aircraft to veer off course, thus giving the effect of relative movement of the planet. So that's a tantamount to saying the pilot, came off course and didn't know. Now, Rainbow sort of took offense to that basically, because he said, if anybody thinks that I allowed an aircraft on autopilot to veer off course in the manner that it must have done in order for that, to be Venus all the time, then I'm a prize idiot, because that was the statement he made. So this is the upshot of the case. You have to look at the information. You can't just say, oh yeah, because it looks like something that's scintillating on the horizon, it must be a planet, it must be Venus. You have to see all this other information in context to know that actually it can't be. So what was it? that was a $64,000 question at the time. But it was probably New Zealand's biggest case. There had been a few before that, but they were very small scale. This is probably the biggest case, and it had reams of pages of devoted to it in the various New Zealand papers. There was a fledgling civilian organization at the time in New Zealand. They actually sort of took it on board. I passed you a graphic which actually has the information about it, and that's actually taken from one of the pages of one of their magazines at about that time that show the course of the aeroplane. It's all quite crudely drawn, but it shows that to some detail. That's it there. So you can see the flight path of the aircraft. You've got various annotations around about time and what happened, the course it was taking, how the object actually moved in relation to the airplane. So you can see where it started at the bottom there, and it moves off the port wingtip all the way to the front of the airplane. Now, if that was Venus, it can't do that as quick as that airplane's flying, and it's just not possible. So this is where that kind of theory lies dead in the water. But it was quite big. It sparked an official investigation, albeit it was going to be Venus. So it was quite a thing in New Zealand. And it also sparked one other thing, which isn't written in the book, but actually people who will remember me talking about this case for the Foo Fighters from World War II. A New Zealand fighter pilot who had been with 43 Squadron in the war, he was retired living in New Zealand. He saw all the furore about this and the statements made by the Air Minister. So he wrote to him saying, you might want to know about something that happened to me in 43 over North Africa, where a light followed my hurricane around. So you see, it kind of, it got other people thinking, well, maybe I should tell them about my story as well. So yeah, that's the New Zealand case.
That's amazing. It's fascinating. Yeah. Really, yeah. It does beg the question. Do they? These pilots are, that's their job. To have to even be told that you did this wrong, you maneuvered wrong. It was as I'm trying to be like down the middle. I don't want to just blindly believe he saw a UFO, but to go just to simply say that. From the front to the back.
It's Occam's razor, isn't it? So
right.
if you're not there at the time, then it's the easiest thing in the world to say it must be that. And of course, that's classic debunking anyway. But then you have to look at all the other information and say, well, okay, you say that, but it can't be that because this other thing has happened. So, you have to, as you say, you've got to take everything together and go, okay, well, I've ruled this out, ruled that out. It's that Sherlock Holmes thing, isn't it? You rule everything out and only the improbables left. So,
yeah. But then you think, he says it's at their altitude at one point, it's lower than their altitude at another point, it's only 10 to 15 miles away. I mean, I'm sure these people are pretty used to seeing distant celestial bodies in the sky at certain times of day.
Well, he had 10 years flying experience, 8 of which as an airline pilot and a captain. So, he was pretty used to seeing things at night. And these guys would actually run the same kind of schedule, maybe night after night or month after month. So they would be, they would see things in certain places, certain times of year that they would know what they were. So this is the kind of what you got to get past in order to try and work out what some of these things were.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It is. It really is. Wow, great case. Now let's come on to, like I've mentioned probably a couple of times already, one of my favorite cases of all time. What can you tell us about 1956 Lakenheath Bentwaters?
Well, maybe I should just let you describe it, Vinny. Only kidding. This is a really major case for Britain, and it wasn't just RAF aeroplanes. There were actually US Air Force ones as well. So you had a couple of pilots from a US Air Force airplane, a training jet. You had controllers on the ground at an American Air Force base, albeit strictly speaking an RAF base, because that's the terms of how the Americans operate in Britain. They're all called RAF stations, but they are still speaking, still really American airfields. So you had those pilot ground staff as well. But then you have RAF squadron night fighters, jet night fighter crews, and quite a few of them, as you're well aware, and also RAF radar controllers as well, who get in on the act. And then you can jump forward from 56 right through to the Condon report of 1968, 1969, and somebody sends them a letter, effectively, with a whole load of information, which is all to do with this case. And he's one of the American radar technicians. I believe Bentwaters, I think it is. Bentwaters or Lakenheath. I can't remember offhand. I would have to actually look at the pages. And that's one thing about this case. It has so much information in it that I don't think anybody can actually just reel it off the top of their head with, and know everything about it. There's so much to do with it. It takes over like 20, 25 pages, maybe even more in the book, to just display, basically explain it all. It is so multi-layered, this story. So you've got a whole range of witnesses. And it basically starts at Bentwaters, which there's two airfields in East Anglia in the UK, which is the kind of eastern part, the bit that sticks out above London towards the North Sea. And there's Lakenheath and Bentwaters, and they're not far from each other. It's only a matter of 10, 15 miles or so. And the circuits almost overlap for landing. So they're very close. And of course, if you see something strange at one field, then you're probably going to see it at the other one as well. And this is effectively what happened. So to start with, on the evening, I think it was the 13th of August, 1956, the tower of Bentwaters, they start picking up these strange contacts on the radar, and there's actually there's a jet dispatched to look for them, but they can't find anything. But also at the same time, across at Waterbeach Airfield, which is an RAF station, further south than this in Cambridgeshire, there's a squadron detached there from Coltishall, which is near Norfolk, near Norwich, in Norfolk. This is 23 Squadron, and they're flying Venoms, de Havilland Venoms. They're two-seat night fighters, and they are a couple of their aircraft are dispatched for these mystery radar contacts as well. So it's all kind of kicking off in the late hours of the 13th of August. But they never find anything. And one of the aircraft actually has a problem with its tip tanks, so it has to come back to base. So it's all fairly kind of, sort of unsatisfactory, let's say. But then the kind of focus of everything switches across to Lakenheath as well. So you have, their radar, their ground control approach radar. So that's basically to guide airplanes down on the runway. It's not an intercept radar. It's not radar controllers saying to a jet, this is where your contact is, steer this way, it's 5 miles ahead of you, that kind of thing. Yeah. It's, vectors to land. So their radar pick up these objects as well. And of course, they're trying to, this is where the confusion in this case lies, because actually there's quite a lot of confusion as well. So that's part of the problem. And the controllers there, according to this source who wrote to the Condon Committee, suggest that they were controlling RAF night fighters. But then further down the line, an RAF radar controller, like a supervisor, who would actually come across talk of this case in the newspapers and also in Flying Saucer Review, then wrote to the papers and to Flying Saucer Review and said, actually, what this American guy has said is all rubbish, because we were controlling the jet night fighters. That was our job. So that's going to be dead confusing to everybody who's listening to this now. I've just thrown a whole lot of information at you. You're better off reading the book and also going back to one of Vinny's previous interviews. And I'll let you explain which one that is.
Yeah, absolutely. I sat down with Dr. David Clark back in early 2022 to talk about this case. He had researched it thoroughly, but also interviewed some of the individuals involved with the case in their elder years. They're no longer with us, some thorough interviews. And I think some of the things or the major points that stood out to me is that these ground radars were picking up regular Russian craft planes coming across the North Sea, buzzing the UK during the Cold War. But there was one of these radars had picked up this object's coming in at a seriously very fast speed, but stopping on a dime as well. Things that were completely unusual.
And of course, anything coming over the North Sea would have been interesting. They would have sent aircraft up to find it. And that was their job. And they would practice that even if there weren't contacts. So they were well prepared for this kind of thing. And they wouldn't expect anything to come over land, because these, if they were Russian aircraft, and they did come over the Baltic and fly over, or down the North Sea rather. So they were intercepted at different times. But if that was the case, then they would be intercepted well offshore, they weren't going to be intercepted over East Anglia. That was a failure of our radar and also our air defense if they could even get anywhere over the coast. So it was a major concern that strange things that they couldn't identify, couldn't explain, were flying around, not just over England, but in the vicinity of 2 American Air Force bases.
Yeah. And one major thing that stood out to me is that this case was featured in Project Blue Book, but it was in the 700 cases that couldn't be explained.
That's
and they tried to kind of hush up.
And even though Captain Gregory, who I mentioned before, the one who, if there's a balloon mentioned anywhere near the case, it's going to be a balloon. He did his best, also with the help of various experts, to try and just rubbish it, just saying there were radar angels, effectively, false propagation echoes, all the rest of it, and also the meteor showers, which, coincidentally, did happen. There was a peak of one of the annual meteor showers at that time. So he basically wrote it off any way he could, but clearly there was a lot more going on, because at one point, one of the jet pilots and the navigator, he's told, or he says, it's on our I think it's on our tail.
Yeah.
Because it's switched around from them actually trying to follow it to it actually getting behind them. So There's a whole lot of things like that going on. There's also a suggestion that actually what they were trying to intercept was a stationary item. And that would have made it very, very difficult for the jet fighter crews at that time to do that, because they weren't kind of suited for that. A fast-moving jet, even though one doing maybe 400 or 500 miles an hour, couldn't easily intercept something that was standing still.
No.
So let's say, for argument's sake, a UFO comes into a hover. They would find it incredibly difficult to intercept it because of their closing speed and the way the radar worked as well. There's a phrase, what they would say, it was coming down the tube at them, and that means effectively the range was just coming down really quickly as they were gaining on it, because obviously if it wasn't moving and they were, the kind of rate of closure is quite quick, and then they would just overshoot it. And then, that's when, you could then maybe argue, well, now it's on our tail. But actually, it's a bit more nuanced than that. And really, we haven't got the space here to basically explain everything to do with this case.
Sure.
But, look at your interview with Dave Clark and also read the book, because then you get a much better picture of exactly how, it's not something you can really explain in just a, sort of 10, 15, 20 minutes even. Exactly. It's quite involved. But actually, I do owe Dave a big, sort of like, amount of thanks, because not only did I also use the information that he got regarding one of the American jet pilots who wrote something to him about this case. So I featured that in the book with his permission. But I also lent heavily on Dave and his colleagues, the Lakenheath group. They have a different name, but it's effectively a group of researchers. Back when he said they were contacting the former pilots, and they were getting all this information. Without that information, which actually is freely available on the internet, you couldn't tell this story, because there is so much out there and so much they actually gathered in terms of the pilot testimony, that you can't tell the full story without it. So yes, with that, I owe them a huge amount of gratitude for being able to sort of piece together the story through that information.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll link my interview with David down below, but I recommend to everybody, if Graeme's putting over 25 pages of this case into this book, it is very, very much worth looking into. So please go and buy the book and check it out. Graeme, before I let you go, I'd like to talk about what you've got coming up, because I believe there's 2 conferences that you're speaking at this year.
Well, one might be one that's organized by somebody not a million miles away from me on this screen. So I'll let you advertise that one, maybe. And then actually, I'm going to one in Hull in September. So I'm actually got I'm the Outer Limits conference, so I'm doing a talk there.
Yeah. There will be an advert probably earlier on in this video for my conference that you are so graciously speaking at. And I'll say what I've said to you again before, is that you gave a lecture at the Awakening conference in the UK last year, and I think your slot was 30 minutes or
30 minutes.
Yeah, and you
did overrun a little bit, but not by much. Yeah, I had 30 minutes.
Yeah, it was one of the best most greatest visual and detailed lectures of that event for me personally, and it's like this is something that needs to be expanded upon. So, you know, when I was putting this conference together, I just had to have you there for you know, at least an hour. So I'm looking forward to that. And then yeah, you mentioned there the Outer Limits in Hull, some veteran researchers from the UK as well as yourself. So I'm hoping to make it there if I'm in the UK at the time. But it's good to see you getting your voice out there, not just in book form, but you know, being able to do these conferences as well. So no, it's good stuff.
Yep. Cheers, Vinny.
No, my pleasure. Well, Graeme, listen, thank you so much for joining me. It's always an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate the work you do. It's been an inspiration to me all the way through the last few years from actually doing some good research. So thank you.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. Cheers.
And everyone watching, please check out the links in the description to all of Graeme's books. I highly recommend starting at the start with the Foo Fighters book and working your way through. You will be forever grateful that seriously good research is still being done in this subject. But for now, guys, take care, and we'll see you on the next one. Goodbye.